This is the Appian Way, the first great Roman road. A marvel of engineering, built to move legions and commerce, the lifeblood of a republic. But in the year 71 BC, this road was not used to carry life, but to display death. For 120 miles, from Capua to the gates of Rome itself, it was transformed into a corridor of unimaginable terror. On both sides of this road, 6,000 crosses were raised. On each cross, a man was nailed and left to die. This was not simply an execution. It was a declaration, written in the language of slow, public agony. It was the final, brutal answer to the question that had terrified the Roman Republic for 2 years. What is the price for a slave who dares to be free? This is the story of the war that led to that road, and the meticulous anatomy of the state-sponsored pain used to end it. To understand the crosses, you must first understand the cage. Our story begins not in the halls of the Senate, but in the filth and despair of a gladiator school in Capua, 73 BC. Here, men were not men. They were res, things, property, human livestock purchased and trained for one purpose: to entertain the masses by killing and dying in the sand of the arena. They were Thracians, Gauls, Germans, warriors captured in distant lands, their skills now perverted for sport. Among them was a man named Spartacus. History tells us he was a Thracian, a former auxiliary soldier in the Roman legions, possibly a deserter or a prisoner of war. He was not a philosopher or a revolutionary. He was a professional soldier who knew the machinery of Roman violence from the inside, now condemned to be its victim. The life of a gladiator was short and brutal, but it was not without structure. They were a brotherhood of the damned, bound by their shared fate. And in that brotherhood, a desperate plan was forged. It was not a grand vision of liberation. It was a simple, primal scream for survival. Armed with nothing more than kitchen knives and meat cleavers stolen from the school's cookhouse, some 70 gladiators fought their way out of their prison. They were free. But they were now fugitives in the heart of the most powerful republic on earth. What happened next was not a plan. It was a contagion. As news of the successful breakout spread, the army of the desperate began to grow. Runaway slaves from the vast agricultural estates, impoverished farmers who had lost their land to the wealthy elite, deserters from the legions, all flocked to Spartacus's banner. They were not a disciplined army. They were a rolling tide of the dispossessed, a servile infection that Rome, in its arrogance, initially dismissed. Rome sent a local militia to crush them. The slaves, using their wits, rappelled down cliffsides on vines and attacked the Roman camp from behind, annihilating them. Then Rome sent a praetor with a larger force. They too were outmaneuvered and defeated. Then 2 full consular armies, the backbone of the Republic, were dispatched. And they too were humiliated, their commanders killed, their standards captured. The shock in Rome was profound. This was no longer a simple slave revolt. It was a full-blown war, a deep wound to the pride of a nation that saw itself as the master of the world. The rebellion had become a roaring fire, and Rome now understood that it could not be contained. It had to be extinguished, utterly, and without mercy. The Roman Senate, gripped by panic, turned to one man: Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was not a celebrated general like Pompey or Caesar. He was the richest man in Rome, having made his fortune on real estate speculation during times of civil war. He was ambitious, ruthless, and saw the war against Spartacus not as a duty, but as a political opportunity to seize the military glory that had always eluded him. Crassus raised 6 new legions with his own money and took command of the war. He brought with him a level of discipline that was itself a form of terror. When one of his legions broke and fled in battle against the slaves, Crassus revived an ancient, brutal punishment. Decimation. This is the anatomy of Roman military law. The legion was divided into groups of 10. Each group drew lots. The soldier who drew the short straw was then beaten to death by the other 9 men in his group, his own comrades. Imagine the psychological horror. It is a punishment that says, "The enemy is not your greatest threat. We are." It was with this terrifying internal discipline that Crassus turned his army into a relentless killing machine. He pursued Spartacus's army south, trapping them in the toe of Italy. There, Crassus undertook a monumental feat of engineering. He built a wall, nearly 40 miles long and 15 feet high, complete with a ditch, sealing the rebels off from the rest of the country. As winter set in, the slave army began to starve. Desperation grew. They attempted to build rafts to escape to Sicily, but the rafts were destroyed by a storm. They were cornered, trapped. The predator had his prey. In a final, desperate act, Spartacus's army broke through the wall, but was hounded by Crassus's legions. The final battle was a scene of utter carnage. Spartacus, knowing the end was near, is said to have killed his own horse, declaring that if he won, he would have his pick of horses, and if he lost, he would not need one. He died as he had lived for 2 years, on his feet, fighting in the front lines. His body was never identified, lost in the sea of slaughtered rebels. The war was over, but the message had not yet been sent. Crassus had captured 6,000 survivors. The question facing him and the Senate was not if they should be executed, but how. A swift death in the arena or by the sword was too merciful. It was the death of a soldier. These were slaves, property that had dared to have a will of its own. Their punishment needed to be a lesson, not just an end. It needed to be a form of public humiliation designed for maximum, prolonged agony. The choice was clear: crucifixion. Crucifixion is an instrument of torture engineered for a slow death. Whether nailed or tied, the victim's arms are outstretched, putting immense strain on the wrists and shoulders. The primary cause of death is often positional asphyxia. To breathe, the victim must push up on their nailed feet to relieve the pressure on their chest muscles. This causes excruciating pain in the legs, so they slump back down, and the struggle to breathe begins again. It is a horrifying cycle of agony and suffocation, prolonged by dehydration and exhaustion, often lasting for days. It was, by design, the most shameful and painful death the Roman world could conceive. Crassus did not execute the 6,000 in one place. He orchestrated a far grander spectacle, a project of state-sponsored terror. Along the entire length of the Appian Way, from Capua, where the rebellion began, to the very gates of Rome, he ordered the crosses to be raised, one every 100 feet or so, for 120 miles. Imagine traveling that road in the weeks that followed. At first, you see one cross, a stark silhouette against the Italian sky, then another, and another. Soon, you realize the road is lined with them, stretching to the horizon in both directions. The visual horror is compounded by the sensory assault. The smell of death, sweat, and excrement hangs heavy in the air for miles, and the sound, a symphony of suffering. The groans of the dying, the desperate pleas for water, the curses against the gods and Rome, the weeping that eventually fades into a low, constant hum of agony. This was the soundtrack of Roman victory. Now, imagine the experience from the cross, the sun beating down, the torment of thirst, the flies and birds that begin to gather. You see thousands of your comrades, the men you fought beside, sharing your exact fate. You watch them die one by one. You see the faces of the Roman citizens passing below, some horrified, some indifferent, some triumphant. Your defiance slowly boils away under the sun, replaced by delirium, and then, finally, by the release of a slow, suffocating death. This was the true purpose of the Appian Way crucifixions. It was not justice for the 6,000. It was a message for the millions of other slaves across the Republic. It was a 200-kilometer-long scream, a warning carved into the landscape itself. The rebellion of Spartacus forced the Republic to confront its deepest fear, and in its victory, Rome showed its true face. The crosses eventually came down, the bodies were removed, but the road remained, no longer just a path of commerce, but a permanent monument to the price of defiance and a chilling testament to the anatomy of fear.